Welcome to the third and final part of our beginning mixer series in Cubase. Hey guys, this is Steve from Featherlight Studio, and this is the third and final part of our beginning mixer series in Cubase. Now, we've already done a ton of work, and I'll put the first two videos in the links below so you guys can catch up to us. Go back and catch those before you watch this, as everything we're going to talk about in this video and go through has already been explained in the previous two videos. In this video, we're going to take the mix we've worked on so far and all the things we've done up to this point, and we're going to build some custom vocal chains, and then we're going to see how all those parts work together and affect our master bus. Let's check it out. At the end of our previous video, we had just finished mixing some funk guitar, and it's time to move on to the additional instruments. We've got some keyboard tracks in the project, we've got some brass sounds, and we have an electronic piano sound. So let's unmute those and hear what they sound like. We'll pull them up. All right, so let's start with the electronic piano sound. We want that to be opposite the guitar. Now, it's important to understand that both the keyboard tracks here are actually stereo tracks. So we can use stereo effects on them, but we still want to put them in a space. So we want that opposite the guitar. Let's solo the guitar track and the keys together. We're going to move the keys over opposite the guitar. So a little to the right. All right, so that's a nice spread, and both instruments have their own space. The only thing we're going to do to the keys, since the keys are direct and sound great already, is we're simply going to add that tube compressor again we've been using a lot of, and we're going to have it on fairly moderate settings, but we're going to add some drive to it to help warm it up a little bit. And then we'll hear the compressor before. Here's what it sounds like after. Just brings it up a little bit and sounds a little warmer because the keys can have a tendency to sound a bit sterile. The next thing we're going to do is actually use a send. These are easily created by right-clicking anywhere near the window under the sends tab. And we've already gone ahead and put a reverb on the aux bus that the send is currently pointing to. And the reverb on our project reverb aux send is going to be Revelation, and this is going to be a medium hall. And this is also going to be set at 100% mix. There's a very important reason for this. It's because we don't want any other sound other than the affected sound to be coming from the aux sends. We don't want any dry sound coming through, otherwise we'd just be adding volume. We'll isolate the keys so we can hear what that's going to be. All right, as we bring up that send slider amount, you can hear that it actually starts to become part of that space and fills in with the rest of the project. All right, sounds great. We'll back it off just a hair. And the next thing we're going to be dealing with is the brass sound. Let's bring that up. All right, again, this is a stereo track, so we can use stereo effects on it, but we're actually going to leave the tracks themselves with just two things. We're going to add that great Pultec copy we had to add a little bit of high-end shimmer around 12K. We're going to boost that a little bit, and that's going to make it just a hair brighter and bring it forward. And we're going to use the stereo delay because this is a stereo track. And this is just going to add a quick slapback delay to the brass parts to help spread it around the stereo field. We're using the Sweet Vocal Delay preset with delay taps 1 and 2 being identical and only about an 8% total mix, very light. And then in addition, we're going to be using that send, the reverb send that's going to send it over to our project reverb as well. This is going to be pretty subtle. And the last thing we're going to be doing with our overall keyboard sound is going over to our keys bus, and we're going to be putting on a vintage compressor on the bus itself. And we're going to be choosing the hard piano preset, and we're going to change it a little bit, but that gets it in the ballpark here. We're going to use a fairly low ratio, so this isn't super heavy-handed, and we're going to use a fairly quick attack, so the peaks of the brass don't sneak their way through. And we could put the compressor just on the brass track, but we want the bus compressor to glue all the keyboard instruments together as a single unit and kind of warm them up and make them work together, because it all has to balance against the guitar part. Now that we have a nice balance between all the drums, the bass, and the rest of the instruments, it's time to move on to the guitar solo. And it's important to note that this is recorded straight off the guitar amplifier. We didn't run direct, so we're not using Cubase's really powerful VST amp emulators on this. That's a story for another day. And of course, the soloist on this is the incomparable Mr. Dennis Morris, the guitarist for the band Redbone. You might have heard some of their stuff on the first soundtrack of the Guardians of the Galaxy. Dennis always does such an amazing job here in the studio, just a fantastic guitarist, and the guitar's already in mono. It's a mono track, so we don't really need to change the stereo image. It's already straight up. And the only thing we're really going to add here is just an EQ that's going to roll off some of the bottom information. We don't need anything down there competing with the bass guitar, especially on a guitar solo. And the other thing we're going to change here is we're going to add a mono delay to the track itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep the sync button going, because that syncs the delay to the tempo of the project, and it makes it very easy to set our delay times. We're going to choose 1/8 of a second for a delay. We're going to keep the feedback at a little long. It's actually going to be, 35%. This means the delay tap itself is going to go more than once, and it's going to give that individual solo and the notes a little life to them. And we're not going to have a ton of mix here, only about 8%. This is what it sounds like before. All right, super dry, as you can tell. This is after. And you can hear those delay taps trailing off into the distance. Now, this could be done while you're recording if you actually recorded the delay from the guitar player's pedal. The problem with that is that the pedal delays don't always match the project tempo. This is obviously an artist preference thing, but whenever possible, if you can print the delay later, you have a lot more control. All right, next thing we're going to do is go directly over to the guitar bus. And this is the guitar solo bus, not the regular guitar bus. And we're going to add a couple things here as well. We're going to add an EQ at the top. And by the time you actually get to the guitar solo, if you solo it by itself, it always sounds great. But when you actually listen to it in the project, a lot of times what will happen is you'll start to hear conflicts. So we're just going to use the EQ to dip a few frequencies in the mid-range just so it doesn't compete directly with the bass tone so much. And the last thing we're going to follow it with is exactly what we did earlier with the funk guitar part. We're going to add a spring-style tube reverb with Steinberg's Reverence reverb, and this thing adds a great and unique guitar space to the track. So let's listen to what that sounds like just in the mix. All right, and as you can hear, when you solo the guitar by itself, it sounds like there's a lot of effects going on, maybe too much, until you put it in the mix. Then it sits in the mix really well, and that's really the beauty of using mono delays on the track and spring stereo reverbs on the bus. But there's still one more thing we need to do to really make the solo guitar fill up the stereo field, and that is we need to widen the signal. So in order to do that, we're going to take a send off the guitar solo bus, and we're going to send it over to the Vox delay. Now, we've set up Steinberg's stereo delay on our aux delay channel. We've used that same sweet vocal delay preset on the delay, but we've changed the tap times left and right to be slightly different, and the mix is at 100%, just like the reverb aux bus is, because the only thing we want going through here is delay sound. And then also we're going to disable the spring reverb for a second, just so you can hear the delay by itself. So let's disable Reverence and listen just to what the stereo delay is actually doing. Much wider, much bigger overall stereo image, and then let's add the reverb back in for the whole thing. Now that we have a working mix of all the drums, the instruments, and the solo sections, it's time to move on to the star of any mix, and that is the vocals. Up next, we're going to create a custom vocal effects chain. Now, there's entire plugins in Cubase, especially the later versions of Cubase, that can do an entire effects chain in just one plugin. But I want to break it down step by step so that you know what each one of the things inside that effects chain is actually doing. That way you can build your own effects chains in other DAWs. So let's move on to the vocals bus. We'll unmute it, start pushing it up, and see what we have to work with for vocals.
I don't need a thing. Don't need no trip to Vegas. Don't need no diamond ring.
All right, so we got a nice clean vocal to work with that's well recorded, and we're going to move over to the vocal track here. And as we talked about before, Cubase has plugins like Vocal Chain that can do an entire vocal effects chain all by itself with all these modules working simultaneously. But we're going to actually build our vocal chain from scratch because I want you to understand what's in a vocal chain and why those things are there, what they're actually used for, and the order they go together is really important. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use an EQ, and we're just going to be using this to take out any unwanted low frequencies and rumble out of the vocal channel that might have snuck their way in during recording, and we're not going to be doing anything else with the other bands here unless we had a real problem. If there was a giant peak for some reason, like in one of this areas, we could possibly pull that out with this at this stage. But the sole purpose of the pre-EQ is just to take the problems out of the vocal effects chain so that they don't fool the downstream effects. All right, the next thing we're going to put in is a tube compressor. You're getting pretty familiar with this one. And just like on a lot of other examples we've shown here, we're using two compressors, one on the track and one on the bus, to accomplish the same thing instead of just using one big compressor. This particular one isn't going to be doing a ton of work, but it is going to be adding some drive here. And it's also going to be adding some character as well. And we're going to try to set it up so that the input doesn't actually have the compressor doing any more than about -3 or -4 dB total reduction here. Like I said, we want this compressor to do a little bit of the work, and we want the one on the vocal bus to do a little bit of work as well. Let's listen to what the vocal sounds like before this.
You don't need to worry. I don't need a thing.
That's what it sounds like after.
You don't need to worry. I don't need a thing.
Our attack down here is fairly quick, which means it's going to grab those dynamic performances really quickly. We're not going to have any transients sneaking through here. It's got a fairly gentle release, so that works great for vocals. And the other thing you're going to notice here is the mix knob. The mix knob is set at 50%, which means only 50% of this total effect is actually going to be heard. This is often referred to as parallel processing, but what it means is part of the dry signal is going to sneak through and be blended with the sound of the compressor signal. And that gives us a very clever way of retaining some of those original dynamics without them becoming problematic. So let's take a listen to this.
You don't need to worry. I don't need a thing.
If we crank this all the way and it's 100% of the compressor, we get something more like this.
You don't need to worry. I don't need a thing.
As you can hear, it's not just quieter, but it's a lot more squashed. And this is part of the issue. So by using our mix knob, which effectively means it's parallel compressing, we get the best of both worlds. All right, so that's our tube compressor. The next thing we're going to do is an EQ that is going to change the character and tonal quality of it. This isn't just a problem solver like the first one in the chain. This one is actually going to bump the bottom end at 100 hertz here. Now, you might be asking, because we took that out, we only rolled it off starting at 100 hertz down. So this means when we actually give this a little boost right around 100 hertz here, that means we can safely boost the low end of the vocal without boosting that low-end rumble that might have been present in the beginning. We're also going to add a little bit of mid-range here, and we're going to add a little shimmery top from about 10K on a shelf up. The next thing in the chain is going to be a de-esser, and this is really important because this is how we control that sibilance. So every time we get things like S's and T's and things like that, this is going to help remove those. So this is what it sounds like before.
You don't need to worry. I don't need a thing.
So we're going to be using this to take some of those highly sibilant T sounds out of there completely. And we're going to do that by using the reduction and the threshold knob. And this little area here, this is where that reduction is going to take place.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
As that red highlighted area starts to drop, more and more of that sibilant T sound gets removed from the vocal performance. And right about here from 5 or 6K up is where a lot of those take place. We could actually move this around and drop it even lower, but for the time being, we're just going to do that. Now, if we drop the threshold all the way, notice how much red you'll start to see.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
It takes 100% of the S's and all that brightness that we work so hard for out of it completely. We don't want to do that. We only want it to happen when those S's and things take place. So the threshold knob controls when it starts to work, and the reduction knob controls how much work it does. All right, and the last thing we're going to put on our vocal track is going to be a mono delay. And just like the mono delay on our solo guitar track, this is just going to give it a little bit of body so that it doesn't stop completely when the performer stops singing. This is the vocal before.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
All right, as you can hear, that just stops bone dry, literally. There's nothing to help it sit in the mix. So this is going to help do that. And we're going to use an 1/8 of a note delay length, and we're going to keep it on sync because that means it actually syncs to the project tempo, which means it's even going to be more transparent. And we're only going to use about 5% of this. So let's hear what it sounds like afterwards.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
Now that might sound like a lot when you solo the channel, but it's not going to be when we put it in the mix.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
This is a little trick that's actually used to set mono vocals into the mix without making it sound like it has a delay on it. So this is not to make it sound like an effect. This is just to have it sit in a space that sounds real. All right, let's jump over to the vocals bus here. And the first thing we're going to use on the vocals bus is Steinberg's Vox Comp. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the background of this compressor as well. But like we talked about before on lots of our other tracks examples, we're going to be having a track compressor. That's the tube one over here on the track, and the one here on the bus compressor working in tandem to get us more transparency instead of having just one compressor on all the vocals and having it clobber it. All right, and the next thing we're going to do here is set this so that it's not doing a ton of work. We're going to treat this like a bus compressor, meaning if you look at the dry wet knob, it's set at 100%, unlike the tube compressor that was set at 60. We want to hear 100% of this compressor's effect because we want this to glue everything together. All right, let's listen to what we have without it.
Don't need no trip to Vegas, don't need no diamond ring.
All right, so it sounds great and it's nice and present, but some of those punchy dynamic parts are still jumping out of the mix quite a bit, and we want to rein those in and make them sound really cohesive. This is what it sounds like with it.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing. Don't need no trip to Vegas, don't need no diamond ring.
All right, so as you can hear, even when he's really screaming into the mic and getting a little gutsy and everything there, it's not punching through the compressor like it was with just the tube compressor on the track. And the last thing on our vocal bus is Steinberg's EQP1A, and we're just going to add a little bit of its silky analog top end at around 12K. We're just going to boost that a little bit and help bring the vocal up. This is what it sounds like without it.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
And this is what it's going to sound like afterwards. We'll bring that up to about here.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing. Don't need no trip to Vegas, don't need no diamond ring.
Now it's time to put our vocals into a real space and make them sound like they're part of the mix. So we've set up Steinberg's Revelation reverb on our vocal reverb aux bus and a stereo delay on the delay aux bus in order to do that. So let's solo the vocal and hear what it sounds like without the reverb.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
So what you're hearing as that ambience is the mono delay on the track. Let's take that off as well, and you'll hear the track before.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
All right, let's power up the reverb send here, and we'll start bringing this up so you can hear the difference here.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
All right, this is a really smooth, warm reverb, and it just kind of snugs around the vocal like a blanket, and that's the purpose of this. We're not trying to create a giant wash of reverb as an effect. We're using the Vocal Hall Medium preset, and this creates a really believable and really warm reverb space for the vocal to sit in. And by the time we add the mono delay back into it again, we get this.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing.
All right, now we're going to disable those two things, and we're going to go to the delay. And the delay here is going to add widening to the track. It's going to spread the vocal all the way to the left and the right and really help it fill up the entire stereo image.
Don't need no trip to Vegas, don't need no diamond ring.
And the reason it's doing that, you can hear it off to the side of the left or the right there, is because we've chosen the Sweet Vocal Delay preset. But unlike our previous example with the brass sound, we've altered the delay tap times to be slightly different to give us that stereo effect. And that's largely due to the fact that these two delay taps are close to each other, but not identical. One's 218 milliseconds, one's 207. And that's what's responsible for the delays being hard left and right and creating that stereo image.
You don't need to worry, I don't need a thing. Don't need no trip to Vegas, don't need no diamond ring.
Now it's time to focus on our master bus. The master bus section is really what is responsible for our song being punchy and dynamic, but also sounding cohesive, as if it's all glued together in the same space. So let's take a look at what's on our master bus here. We have Steinberg's tube compressor in the pre position, which simply means our master fader won't affect the behavior of the compressor. However, our upstream channels, which are our aux channels, our groups and buses, and our tracks over here, will affect what goes into the compressor. And in the post position following that is going to be our limiter. And this is really here just to keep things from going over digital zero and clipping the master bus. At this point, we've reached a fork in the road. We need to make a decision here because there's two definite directions we could go. If we decide to hand this off to a mastering engineer, this would be a perfect time to stop, do an audio mix down, and send it over to the mastering engineer because we've left them a ton of headroom to work effectively. However, for the purposes of this mixing course, we're going to choose the other fork in the road, which means we're going to be mastering inside of Cubase. We're going to try to maintain as much punch and dynamic range as possible, while also maximizing as much volume as we need to compete with streaming services. And we're going to do that by adding a few different things. If you look at the overall meter in Cubase,
I don't wanna get your number.
we are well below digital zero here, peaking right around -6 and -5. If we jump over to the loudness meter here, we can see that our integrated loudness, which is probably the most important here, is at -19. To compete commercially, this needs to really be somewhere between -14 and -12. Now, there's mixes that are even much louder than that. So to make up the difference, to make up that additional sort of volume and loudness, we're going to change the effects order and add a separate effect on our master bus. We're going to move our tube compressor up one notch, and we're going to add Steinberg's Maximizer plugin to our master bus chain. So this is going to sit really in between these plugins. So our plugin on our master bus chain looks like this. With our Maximizer between the compressor and the limiter, keep your eye on the short-term LUSF meter reading, and we'll see if we can get a little closer to our target loudness.
I said you don't need to worry, I don't need a thing. Don't need no trip to Vegas, don't need no diamond ring.
As you can see, with the addition of the Maximizer, we've retained all the dynamics and punchiness that we need for our mix, but we're a lot closer to that commercial streaming level that's required to compete with other commercially mastered projects. And at this stage, it's a great idea to bounce back and forth between our project and commercially mastered music in the same genre so that we can make a comparison directly between the loudness of our project and the loudness of commercially mastered projects. Once our project is ready for delivery, we can simply go up to File, choose Export Audio, give our project a name, and then choose the appropriate settings. We can change MP3 tagging information here, and we can set the project sample rate and bit rate. And once we're ready to go, we simply add it to the queue and we're ready to export our project out into the real world. Hey guys, thanks so much for hanging out with me and making it all the way through this 3-part series of beginning mixing techniques in Cubase. You guys have done a great job so far, and hopefully throughout this whole process, you've learned something, or hopefully it was helpful. If so, please hit the like and subscription buttons. It really does help keep a channel like this going, and it helps me make more videos and series like these. Stay safe, be creative. Add something creative to the world. They could really use it. Take care. We'll catch you guys in the next video.